Hello and welcome to the show. So some of you may recognise this car from a silly car build I did a little while back. This is a Fiat 500 with an 875 horsepower V6 that's been kept front wheel drive. As you can imagine, it doesn't really work. I have slightly ruined the handling characteristics of this car. When you put so much power through the front wheels, they just can't deal with it, basically. They're trying to deal with power delivery and steering, cornering, it just doesn't work. Out of low speed corners, you just can't use any of the power, it just sits there and spins its wheels. And when you come to the high speed sections, it's even scarier. If you try and use any power through the corners, you get chronic understeer and fall off the road. It's a really hard car to drive. And yeah, I spent 4 laps fighting it when I drove at Sebring. I may have had a slight... the other thing with a front-wheel drive car with this much power, on the opening couple of laps you can have some cold rear tyres. Now that's made worse by the fact the Fiat 500 has got a tiny wheelbase, but yeah, it's a scary thing trying to drive this car around a track. It's just too much power, and I don't think anybody's surprised by an 875 horsepower front-wheel drive car not being very good handling. I'm certainly not. The tyres are just being asked to do far too much. But it did get me thinking. I was wondering how much power would be too much for a front-wheel drive car to sort of use sensibly. What was the limit to the power you could get in a front-wheel drive car while still having it be actually drivable? Once you get to this stage, of course, the car is practically useless. A rear-wheel drive version would be an awful lot quicker. So I devised a little test to see where the limit was. The idea was I'd be comparing a front-wheel drive version of a car to a rear-wheel drive, keeping the parts used exactly the same between the two, the only difference being the driveline. To start it off, I had a 1.6 Astra Techline, the Top Gear Edition car. Using this as a completely standard to set a sort of a baseline, really. To be honest, not the most exciting drive I have ever had with these two cars. Now, to make it easier for you guys, the front-wheel drive cars in this are going to be coloured red, the rear-wheel drive cars are white, so it's easy to keep track of quite what's going on. Yeah, as a standard car, of course, front-wheel drive doesn't have enough power, really, to cause any problems. And when we look at the lap times, it was a 141.8 from the front-wheel drive, a 142.6 from the rear-wheel drive. Now, when you convert them, you do add a little bit of weight for the rear-wheel drive one. It's about 200 pounds difference between the two drive lines. So perhaps some of that, that will affect the time a little bit. It was a bit of a bigger gap than I expected, actually, between the two lap times. The Astra is incredibly slow. Just watching their replay, how slow it is down the straight. Yeah, it wasn't a particularly quick car. That was the results from the standard vehicle. So I decided to up the power. Now I figured that the tyres would be sort of the limiting factor very, very quickly with this. So both cars were fitted with racing tyres, and the horsepower was up to 250. That's not a ludicrous amount. There are plenty of front-wheel drive hot hatches with around that sort of power, like Scirocco Rs. In fact, the Focus RS goes up to sort of 300 horsepower, and the Gans have around that. It's not a ludicrous amount of power for a front-wheel drive car to deal with. Interestingly, when we look at the lap times, it was a 130.1 from the rear-wheel drive car, a 131.4 from the front-wheel drive. There is a big old gap here between the two. Now, I will be honest, each car was given 5 laps around Catalunya National, and it's possible I just didn't drive quite as quickly with the front-wheel drive. I didn't quite get the ultimate pace out of the car. I do know this track pretty well, and I didn't have any noticeable errors with the front-wheel drive car. I certainly got a couple of quick laps out of it. So, yeah, I was a little bit confused by just the size of the gap between these two, because the front-wheel drive car certainly wasn't a problem to drive. I wasn't having chronic understeer with it. I upped the power some more to see what would happen. I put the inline-4 turbo rally engine into the car, puts out 373 horsepower, which is quite a lot for a front-wheel drive vehicle. And then I sort of noticed the problem with this. While, yes, the tyres meant that the car was still sort of drivable, it was the rest of the chassis, the suspension, the brakes, etc., that I think was skewing the results, basically. As you can see, the body roll in this car is laughable. It's almost a boat as we go through the chicane. It really was less than ideal, and I think the fact that the chassis just couldn't deal with the power, the parts in the car, it just couldn't deal with this much power. It wasn't really down to the drivetrain's fault in this one. This wasn't chronic understeer going on. It wasn't horribly hard to drive because of the front wheel drive nature of it, or the rear wheel drive or whatever. It was more that the car just couldn't deal with the speed as we come up towards the first corner. Have a look at how much that's moving and wiggling under braking. That's not nice. It's not nice at all when you're trying to stop a car and the back end is wanting to jump around. So my theory of keeping everything standard apart from the tyres, it wasn't going to work once we started getting up to some more power, certainly not in a standard Astra. So I upped my car a little bit. I upgraded it to the Astra VXR. I quite like this hot hatch. I think it's quite a good looking car. It's also a very nice driving car. Actually, the front wheel drive version of this handled its power perfectly well. I think it's about 270 horsepower you get from this. And yeah, the front wheel drive one certainly didn't have any problems. Of course, the rear wheel drive one didn't either. As far as lap time wise goes with these standard vehicles, again, I thought I'd just do it for a control test, if you like. It was a 129.4 from the rear wheel drive, a 28.8 from the front wheel drive. So similar results really with the standard Astra itself. It's a little bit quicker on the front wheel drive car. It's a little bit lighter. I certainly think that will definitely play a little bit of a part. Again, I was surprised by the gap in times between the front wheel drive. I expected them to be a lot closer at this stage. Since we'd seen the chassis was giving up, it just couldn't deal with the power in the standard Astra, I decided to max out mere handling parts on this one. And let's face it, if you're building a car for a race series or for random lobby racing, or maybe you're coming to join FailRace versus the community, chances are the first thing you're going to do, at least the first thing I would do, is upgrade the handling parts, and then I would put on whatever power left, whatever PI I had left, I'd make up with power parts. So this VXR Astra has got racing tyres, maximum tyre width, racing suspension, brakes, weight reduction, all of that kind of thing. So we shouldn't have any problems with the with the car itself not being able to cope with the power. Again, I took both of these cars around. We've still got the standard engine in the vehicle. Took them both around for 5 laps, and the results were very similar. It was a 23.6 from the rear wheel drive, a 22.8 from the front wheel drive. In fact, almost exactly the same as the as the standard ones. Yeah, again, front wheel drive car was actually really nice to drive. I much preferred the front wheel drive vehicle for this. It was there was just so much grip. Both cars were very, very grippy because there's not very much power and huge amounts of grip. Front wheel drive car you could push absolutely constantly around this lap. Really nice. The rear wheel drive car would just step out a little bit too much for my liking, but this is not. I wasn't really surprised by any of these results yet. Perhaps a little bit by the size of the gap between the two cars, but everything was going as I had really expected. So time for more power. I opted to use the V6, the same engine that went in the Fiat 500, but at this stage it was left completely stock. 367 horsepower now in this Astra, which it's a sizable amount. I think that would make it the most powerful production front-wheel drive car. I know the Focus RS is about 300 horsepower. I know there are much more powerful modified ones, but for production cars, 360 going through the front wheels, that's a fairly sizable amount. But again, not really expecting it to be hugely hard to drive. I mean, you look at the British touring cars, I think they get 350-ish, and they've got plenty of front-wheel drive cars. And considering this is fully kitted out with race tyres, etc., I wasn't expecting it to have too many problems yet. You know, it's not a ludicrous amount of power going in this, and with all of the racing parts, and I know this is a pretty good car to start with, I wasn't expecting it to have any real problems, and sure enough, the results were fairly similar. At this stage, it's a 121.9 for the rear-wheel drive car, sorry, a 121.7 for 21.17, sorry, for the front wheel drive. Sorry, trying to read this off a book is quite hard to keep finding my place. Yeah, the front wheel drive car was holding its own. It was still going quicker, and it was still the nicer of the two to drive with this much power. It wasn't having any understeer problems, really. You do see the occasional puff of smoke coming from the front wheels, but it's certainly nothing particularly bad. The rear-wheel drive car was just a little bit twitchy. I may have got a little bit carried away on the speed front, thinking I'd take too much speed through there. But there was plenty of grip in the front-wheel drive car. I wasn't having understeer problems. I wasn't having problems putting the power down. The main problems I was getting was with the rear-wheel drive one being a little bit twitchy. So it was time for some more power. 450 horsepower now in this car. I expected this would be the stage at which a front-wheel drive car would start to struggle. I mean, we're looking at almost as much power as a Ferrari F40 now, going into an Astra. Yes, we've got racing parts, etc., but you are now starting to ask quite a lot of the front tyres. The rear-wheel drive car, it was a little bit twitchy at times with this much power. I think this car is designed to be a front-wheel drive vehicle, so the rear-wheel drive, a rear-wheel drive version of it does have a slight disadvantage in this, but still the front-wheel drive car held on. Lap time-wise, a 120.2 from the front-wheel drive car, a 120.9 from the rear-wheel drive. It was still keeping around the same gap, 450 horsepower, and the front-wheel drive car is still going quicker. PI-wise as well, the front-wheel drive car was 1 PI higher than this rear-wheel drive one, yet it was quite a bit quicker over the course of the lap. I didn't expect that, I'll be honest. I thought by the 450 horsepower mark you would start to have problems with the front-wheel drive car using that power. Okay, it's not a horrendous amount of power, but it's quite a lot for the front wheels to deal with, but it wasn't having any problems. I was having more problems with the rear-wheel drive one, wanting to be sideways and having the occasional twitchy moment. So yeah, at this stage, I was wondering just how much we could get with this front-wheel drive car. I upped it to 550. That's getting towards supercar territory. And still, the front-wheel drive car wasn't undrivable. Still, it was a perfectly sensible choice. We did start to see problems creeping in, and I'll be honest, by this stage, this is about the limit of the front-wheel drive car. You can kind of judge how difficult it is to drive by the amount of smoke that pours off the front wheels as we go around some of these corners. At 550 horsepower, the understeer starts becoming quite noticeable. Putting the power down out of the lower speed corners isn't too bad yet, but certainly through the longer, higher speed corners, the understeer, it's starting to be noticeable. The rear-wheel drive car is still twitchy, but the understeer in the front-wheel drive starts becoming more significant, and we see that in the lap times. The rear-wheel drive does a 119.2, the front-wheel drive does a 119.6. Pretty close between the two of them, and I'll be honest, I would say that for this car, for this track, this is about the point. This is about the crossover point, 550 horsepower, where you start to get to the stage of, well, it's not quite as nice to drive. I think I would still have the front-wheel drive car out of the two. I think it's a little bit more consistent than the rear-wheel drive one, and the understeer isn't a real problem. It's there, it's noticeable, provided you are a little bit sensible with the trigger. It's perfectly drivable. I didn't expect to say that. It is absolutely perfectly drivable. If tyre wear was significant, sure, it wouldn't really work. As you can see, you do end up spinning the tyres up a fair bit with this car, but it's really very controllable. The understeer is there, but it's not overpowering. And yeah, as I said, I think it's a little bit more. I think it'd be more consistent with the front-wheel drive car. The rear-wheel drive one can occasionally get away from you, can be a little bit twitchy. I mean, this is asking quite a lot of an Astra. Let's face it, putting 550 horsepower through an Astra is not really what it was designed for. So yeah, I was really surprised just how well the front-wheel drive car was doing. So even more power was needed, 625 to be exact. It's only a couple less than a McLaren F1. As you can see, the front-wheel drive car is now struggling some more. More and more smoke is billowing off the front of this car as I try and take higher speed corners. It's really at this stage where the front wheel drive car, much more power than this, and it becomes a pain. It is just about drivable. At 625 horsepower, this car is just about usable for racing. Out of the hairpin there, it wants to spin its wheels. It doesn't really like this corner particularly. It's a very long corner. I'm trying to put power down on the exit, but it's wanting to understeer. It's not undrivable yet. It can still be used, but it will be spinning its wheels through most of the corners. it's just not quite as nice as it was. This is about the stage where I would use the rear-wheel drive one over the front-wheel drive one. As far as lap time wise goes, it's still not a huge gap. An 18.8 for the rear-wheel drive car and 19.3 for the front-wheel drive one. I'm really amazed just how close the two of these remained. 625 horsepower through the front wheels, and it's only, what is that, 0.5 of a second off. That's not bad. That's really quite impressive. How much power he's got. Honestly, much more than 650, and it starts becoming too much power for its own good. It starts becoming unusable. I mean, this much power, the rear-wheel drive version is not the nicest of cars to drive, but it's certainly easier to drive. It's certainly, I'd say, probably a bit more controllable, perhaps, than this front-wheel drive. The understeer, the wheel spinning, just becomes a little bit too much, really, for this car. But keeping on the road is control. I did not expect to be saying that about a 625 horsepower front-wheel drive car. It was remarkably good. It really was. So as far as conclusions go, well, putting more than, I would reckon, about 550 horsepower. I mean, it'll depend on the car and the engine, like quite how it delivers its power, etc. But past about 550 horsepower, front-wheel drives start becoming a bit slower, and past sort of 650, it's going to get very hard to drive very quickly. However, that's a lot more than I expected. I thought that around sort of the 400 mark, you would start seeing the rear-wheel drive car get quicker, but it just didn't happen. The front-wheel drive could cope with the power. It could cope with everything that it was being asked of it a lot better than I expected. And I think the perhaps better conclusion that I can draw from all of this is don't underestimate using a front-wheel drive car. Don't instantly discredit keeping something as a front-wheel drive vehicle, because you might not gain any time. You might even go slower if you convert it to be rear-wheel drive. They can deal with a lot more power than I expected. I was genuinely surprised by the outcome of this. Sure, if you're building a car up for S-Class, it's not going to work keeping something front-wheel drive. It'll be too much horsepower. You'll be asking too much of it. But certainly in an A-Class, in B-Class and lower, a front-wheel drive car is still a fairly sensible option. And I didn't really expect to be saying that when I set out for this experiment. But there you go. That is the answer. Anyway, that is it for today, guys. So thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.